Welcome again to the EOL seminar. Before I introduce our speaker, I have to make a short announcement here. You may have noticed the lack of snacks in our usual place in the hallway out front there. I'm only the messenger here. Due to rule changes coming down from NSF, we can no longer use program funds to provide food at the seminars. In fact, even the coffee and tea we have is only covered should we have any non-NCAR visitors here. So let me ask real quick, do we have any non-NCAR visitors? Ah, wonderful. You will notice, if you do please, that on the table outside where the coffee is located, there's a small clipboard with a sign-up sheet. If you could just put your name and affiliation on there, then the rest of us NCAR folks will greatly appreciate it for helping to provide our coffee and tea. So thank you for that. So our speaker today is already probably well known to most of you. Jeff Stith received his doctorate from the University of Washington, working under Peter Hobbs. He then spent 2 years as a research scientist at the Meteorology Research Incorporated, which, if I'm not mistaken, was founded by Paul McCready. That's the one. Okay, yep. He then joined the University of North Dakota's Department of Atmospheric Sciences, where he rose to be the chair of the department and the Chester Fritz Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric Sciences. His work was based largely on data working with the UND Citation aircraft. In 1999, we coaxed him to come to NCAR as the facility manager as the manager of the Research Aviation facility, where he's, of course, continued his research largely on ice and water cloud formation. And he became a NCAR senior scientist in 2009. So his seminar today is Ice Particles in the Upper Anvil Regions of Mid-Latitude Continental Thunderstorms during the DC-3 program. Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart. Thank you all for coming today. It's a pleasure to do a seminar because it's a good way not only to present the things that are going on, but also to get feedback from you. Many of you in the audience have worked on some of these problems longer than I have, and so I'm anxious to leave room at the end for some questions. So I'm going to try to not get too many slides here and be able to get through this. I do want to recognize the other people that are working with me on this. In the next slide, much of what I'm going to present today is from a recent paper that we did. So the co-authors are listed there, and you'll see a lot of that in today's talk. I'm also going to include some things from earlier work that we did in other parts of the world. And I want to make a little advertisement for some work the graduate students are doing at CSU. So I've got some old and some new here in this presentation. Many of you know that the thunderstorm anvils are an important source of ice particles to the upper atmosphere, and they affect the radiative properties of the atmosphere in very significant ways. Maybe not so well recognized that the chemical properties are likely to be influenced by the type of ice particles. And for the programs like DC-3, where they're looking at the chemistry of convective clouds, understanding the ice formation is going to be important. But the other thing that I want to emphasize is the inventory of particle types. The form mechanisms is really not known as well as I think it should be, and maybe I'm kind of biased on it, but and I really believe that that's partly due to the fact that we still don't have as good a tools as we should to really make full use of the information that's available in these ice particles that act like little raven songs to the stellar history. Peter Hobbs used to like to tell all the students in cloud physics class that an ice particle tells the history of where it's been, and it's really true. But we haven't been able to exploit that very well. And the particular part I want to focus on is this aggregation by electrical forces. Some years ago now, we were looking at ice in the TRIM project, and we discovered in these imagery, which are, I'll say more about some of the instrumentation, but these are photomicrographs of ice particles that were taken in the quadrant study. And we noticed that the particles were lining up in chains. And we thought, gee, this might be an electrical phenomenon. We didn't really do much more other than say that. Paul Lawson also did a conference paper and had much the same observations. And then more recently, Connolly did a review paper where he went and reviewed the laboratory work that's been done on ice crystal aggregation by electrical forces. So I want to say a little bit about his work. He also added a summary of the work that's been done in various parts of the world about these chain aggregate particles, giving some examples. More recently than that, actually about the time the DC-3 project was going, Gaillet et al. Came out with an observation of frozen drop chains in overshooting tops and in a continental storm in Europe. And looking back at some of Paul's earlier work, some of his had some frozen droplets as well. And these were somewhat distinct from the kind of chain aggregates we'd seen earlier, in that they were composed of frozen cloud droplets. And the number of observations you can count on one hand here. So the thought is that the question we had is, are these common? Or this is a one-of-a-time thing? And if they are common, where are they formed? What kind of conditions are present there? The one hypothesis that might come out of this, and I'll say a little bit more later, is that we seem to think they may be preferred in continental storms where you have this abundance of frozen drop aggregates, and that the chains of ice crystals, faceted crystals, may be more prevalent in more tropical clouds. So the Gaillet model was that his paper suggested that there was homogeneous freezing of cloud droplets, and then that followed by aggregation due to electric fields, which he then sampled in situ. And the Connolly et al. Review suggested that the conditions that were necessary for this electrical aggregation were a certain threshold electric fields. They sought a max efficiency at minus 20, but they didn't study it colder than minus 20. They had needed relatively high ice concentration. And then when the particles came within a few radius of each other, there was a short-range attractive force that was responsible for that. So I want to mention a couple of the instruments we're going to use. The instruments include the 2DC, a fast 2DC probe, which is, for most of you are familiar with this, but in case you're not, this is a diode occultation. It has a 25 micron resolution, kind of a workhorse for the last 30-some years for this kind of work. Unfortunately, with a 25 micron resolution, it's really a limitation in terms of the morphology that you can get from that. A more recent instrument for us is called the 3V CPI. The part that I'll be looking at today is a cloud particle imager. It was an instrument that was actually first introduced about 1998, and it gives about a 2.3 micron resolution. So we have an order of magnitude better resolution, which is critical for understanding the morphology. Other instruments that I'm not shown on the wing there, it was the University of Colorado closed path laser hygrometer, which gives the condensed water content. It's an integrating unit. I'm also going to use some data from a vertical cavity surface emitting laser, which is a hygrometer. Will give us the ambient vapor content, and I'm going to use some data from the cloud droplet probe. I'm sorry? On the air, wouldn't that be nice? Don't get me started. Well, yes, we have it on the wish list for sure. I want to show you some data from a case that we're studying in some detail in June 6th. And here is just before the first anvil penetration. You can see the anvil quite distinctly. And in the next diagram, I'll show you the satellite and radar taken almost at the exact time that we were making this pass here. But you get a nice feel for the shape of the anvil and the storm here. And the thing about an anvil like this, you have to remember, is these particles here are among the particles with the lowest fall velocity, and over here, particles with a higher fall velocity. So we might expect to find particles here that are sorted due to their interaction with the updrafts in the cloud. And I think that's a key part of our understanding of what's going on here. So here's a summary of what was done there. The airplane, the part I will show you, starts out here at a fairly high altitude and really near the top of it. We dip into the top of the anvil here. We come around here a little bit lower altitude. We go through it again. We go through a break, and then we go through an anvil over here. It's from this northern anvil, and then there's a southern anvil here. So I'm just going to show you a piece of the data from the sampling that was done here and here, and so forth. But you'll notice that the chill radar has the anvil distinctly, but it does not actually see anything where we found the cloud. So when you go back to this guy, the radar, chill is a pretty sensitive radar, and this is fairly close to it. You don't see anything here. So that made it hard to do sort of radar inner comparisons. But when we project this flight track onto this path right here, you get this track here, so you get an RHI type display. And you can see this is a fairly severe storm with the fairly high tops. And I'll show some data from a little earlier as well. So here's kind of the first results from the Insitu data. We've got the altitude here. Here's the pass at the first pass. We dropped down and we made these two passes through the anvils I mentioned before, and then we went down and did some additional sampling. Now I'm going to show the red here is the concentrations from the cloud droplet probe, CDP, over here, with 15 per cc there. And the blue is from the 2DC, and that's 100 per liter. So these are very different scales here. And in fact, when I saw this 15 per cc from the CDP, I didn't believe it because it's rather unusual to see that high an ice concentration from that instrument. Normally, if we get a tenth per cc, that's much more usual. So I spent about a year trying to convince myself that there must be something wrong with the instruments, since that's part of my job is to doubt the instruments, and there's good reason to believe that things like shattering might be affected. But I think this is actually real, and I think these are actually responding to frozen cloud droplets. From the temperature here, you can see we're at quite cold temperatures, from minus 50s up to even colder than minus 60 at the top of the anvil. And then the cloud droplet probe shows various spikes here. I had expected these were going to be somehow correlated with the 2DC probe, but they weren't. That didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But it started to make sense as I spent more time looking at it. And then finally, this is the relative humidity with respect to ice here. And I'll come back to that, but you can see the 100% line here. So the next thing I'd like to show you is I'd like to go into the top of the anvil and then sort of the edges and the middle part of this and show you some of the images that were produced by the the CPI. I'm just showing a screen capture near the top of the cloud with showing lots of round particles. You can see these particles are all in the order of about 20 microns or so in size. Some of them are out of focus. You can get rid of those if you like. I've kind of tried to keep them in there so we could kind of see a little bit less bias from the sorting what was there. And then you see there's a few particles composed of frozen droplets. Here's another one. There's a triplet there. But by and large, most of these seem to be single particles. As you get a little closer into the cloud, you start to see more of these particles like this, where you have multiple frozen droplets in that manner, and yet you still have some single particles. And then you get further into the core, you start getting more and more of these aggregates, frozen drop aggregates. In this case, you don't see much of anything in the way of faceted crystals for this. This is not true for all the clouds we studied, but for this particular case, that's what it was. Now, in order to study this further, when we look at the 2DC data and the data from the 2DS portion of the 3V CPI, which is indicated here, and you see somewhat of a different picture. You don't see, first of all, you see pretty large particles here. If we look at the 2DS, which is inside that the 3V CPI, and if I can just call this back up again, you'll notice that this instrument is sampling through a tube, whereas this one is sampling through two different arms. So if there is going to be a breakup in this tube here, this would probably be more susceptible to breakup than this, although it's really a subject of active investigation. But when we compare the data from the 2DC with the 2DS, we notice the absence of large particles. And also, these particles are breaking up even in the 2DC, so it's not surprising that they might be breaking up in the 2DS as well. But you can't see frozen droplets here. They just look like aggregate snowflakes. And I've looked at a lot of anvil data with 2DCs, and you really find a lot of this kind of stuff there, but you don't really have a feeling for what's the percentage of depositional grown crystals versus frozen crystals in this kind of data, because the frozen droplets are 20 microns or so, and the resolution of the probe is 25 microns. So why would you expect to see them? So we went to try to go to the region where the large particles were most abundant by looking at the volume distribution, which is plotted here. And we picked this region because it's the particle volume distribution is dominated by millimeter-sized particles. And then we used the volume concentration with the independent measurement of the mass concentration from the closed path laser hygrometer to estimate the density of the large particles. Now, what this does is just fits as a sphere to the whole thing. So, and we've got very tiny aggregates in there. So this is the density average that you get when you do that is really quite small. And yet the low density is probably why the millimeter-sized particles were not observed by the chill radar. Also, the low density is probably easily broken apart during sampling by the 3V CPI. I think it's probably a worse case for the kind of, because these are pretty fragile. So using that data, we can calculate a mass concentration for ice water content. And from the cloud droplets, we used, assumed they were spheres of ice and corrected for the index of refraction changes due to ice. And then for the large particles in blue, we used the density calculated from before. So you can see the relative contributions to the water content from the cloud droplets and from the large aggregate particles separated here. And they're not terribly well correlated. But when you add the two together and you plot them against the independent measurement of mass from the CLH2 instrument, we find that the correlation is quite good. So that result led me to believe that the cloud droplet probe was actually working in this cloud because they are spherical particles, and the instrument is designed to measure spherical particles. It doesn't do a very good job with irregular particles, but these are ice spheres. The triplets and that sort of thing are going to be missized a bit, so you wouldn't expect it to be perfect. But the other thing to note from this is if we look at this, you see in the upper part of the anvil, this is somewhat dominated by the cloud droplets here. And as we go a little bit lower into the anvil, we have the cloud droplets on the edge of the anvil here and here. And then in the center, it's more dominated by the larger particles. And the same is true in the other anvil to some extent, here and here, not quite so much on this end of it. But there's a large particle maximum in the center, and you could see that's where most of the aggregation was. And you go in the regions like this, there are fewer aggregates. So if you put this together in kind of a conceptual model of what this anvil probably looked like, you have something like this. So we take an anvil cross-section through that. You have frozen drops with few aggregates sort of around the top and the edges. And then as you get towards the center, you get primarily aggregates. And then as you get in the lower mid part of it, you have the largest aggregates and really few drops there. So this is kind of a core of large particles and smaller particles around the edge. So if you're looking from space, for example, your bias is going to be towards looking at this with these small droplets, for example, because they tend to occur near the top of the cloud and at the edges. So this structure is something that was quite evident in the June 6th case. I also want to do a little advertisement for work at CSU. This is work that's being done by Brett Basarab, and he's looking at the predicting the flash rate and trying to understand the radar characteristics, such as the change in the height of the 45 dBz surface with time here. So he's plotted the reflectivity in colors here. And then these contours are contours of updraft as determined from the Doppler analysis. And then the superimposed on this is the flash rate over here determined from the LMA data. So the only part of this that Brett didn't provide is this part down here that I added. And a couple things to note here. First of all, the flash rate peaked as this change in the reflectivity happened. We've got a 30 meter a second updraft, and even down low, it's at 10 meters a second. The other part I thought was interesting is if you take the time that we observed those aggregates in the anvil, and we drift them back to the time they would have been formed, you come up with a time period about like this. So you say about the time that the particles we observed in the anvil were formed correlates with the peak in the flash rate there. So if you're looking for support for this electrical aggregation hypothesis, this is at least one measure of that. So this is another picture of the storm characteristics from the chill, showing the motion and the anvil structure. In the vertical RHI section here, I put the minus 38 degree C line here. And if these are in fact having homogeneous freezing at the upper parts of the anvil, you might expect that there would be some enhancement in the updraft due to the release of latent heat. And there is some indication here that that might be true, at least in this one part of it, although it really isn't a dominant force here. But you can see this from the structure. You can also get a feeling for the depth of the updraft during the storm. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the morphology of these particles and what we're finding there from the CPI imagery. And I want to borrow a term from the aerosol of internally and externally mixed. As many of you probably know, the internally mixed refers to you might have a nitrate particle and sulfate particle. If they're one particle, it's sort of an internal mixture. And if they're separate, you have an external mixture. Well, what we find in some of these cases, and these are these cases here from DC3, I put another particle from one of the Quadjex cases just for comparison. So what we have is a particle, for example, here where you have a rime particle and that has collided with a depositionally grown crystal. And so the total ice particle is composed of particles with completely different histories. This particle has maybe 10 droplets on it, and so there's 10 cloud condensation nuclei. This is a depositionally grown one, which would have next to none, maybe one particle or so in it from the nucleation. And so you end up with a particle that has both the different structure due to the different physical history of the particle, but also there's a chemical difference as well in a kind of an internally mixed fashion. In DC3, we found particles that look like this. Here's a plate crystal. Now, normally, these would rime on the edges of the particle. So if this was like a rhyming event in the way we're traditionally looking at a rhyming and production of Groppel, you'd probably expect to see particles rhymed on the edge. But instead you see a fairly pristine crystal that's collided with frozen droplets. So these probably were frozen at a colder temperature. These probably grew at a warmer temperature, and they become this mixture where they have actually aggregated in this case. The other kind of crystal that we found was also a similar sort of thing, but you have a get of frozen droplets, but included with that are some facets. And if you look at some of these, like this particle right here, you have a little bullet which is aggregated with some frozen droplets. So the likely situation here is that these were formed fairly close to the temperature where we found them, or they may have also developed some facets as the particle encountered some additional supersaturation. So some of this is some speculation, but you can see quite a lot by observing these morphology in this manner. So the idea of an internally mixed thing and an externally mixed is kind of central to thinking about what's in the cloud. So I went through the DC-8 anvil cases we had where we had CPI data to try to make an inventory. And this image shows some of the simplest forms where you have doublets and triplets, 4 or 5 in a simple aggregate. And then there's a category, and then these are somewhat arbitrary, but it's illustrative. For example, you have a long chain of particles that have all put together, 20, 30 or more particles that have come in a line. And it's hard to see how that would occur without being driven by some sort of electrical forces. It doesn't seem likely that gravitation would produce such a morphology. So to me, this kind of imagery is a fairly strong support for the fact that there is a electrical aggregation occurring. But then you have them in a more branch structure. I mean, look at this guy here. This is this is really, I find this kind of fun. What's on the top of a thunderstorm? It's little hair-like particles. You know, I mean, who would have thought? I mean, I don't know. Then you get, of course, the large aggregates that are composed of the frozen droplets. And then I've broken this into 2 types, internally mixed type 1, where you get particles that seem to be mixed from very different temperature regions, and then internally mixed type 2, where you have particles that may have grown facets on them internally as they grow. So I think there is some categorization like this that's kind of useful to have. So we went through and looked at the cases from DC3, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this table, but each of these cases had frozen drop aggregates in various proportions. Some of them, such as this ones, were found alone, similar to the 6th of June. Other ones were found with other particle types. So you'd have a region with depositionally grown crystals, so many of which had aggregated. You'd have some frozen drops and so forth in different proportions that are there. But these frozen droplets, aggregates, were found in many of the cases there. Unfortunately, most of them were at cold temperatures. So, but there was one case where we had a warmer temperature. So I want to say a little bit more about that. One question to ask is, how do the particles survive for 30 minutes without evaporating or growing? It would be suggested that the humidity was probably close to ice saturation. And we have the measurements to check that, which I showed earlier. And in fact, for much of this cloud, the saturation was near ice saturation. And so that's really probably the explanation for why particles like this can exist for fairly long periods of time. On the other hand, there are some pockets of ice supersaturation and subsaturation in relatively small amounts. So if you think about what's probably going on in these clouds, you come up with a picture that looks like this, where you have pockets of a slightly above or slightly lower saturation, where some particles can evaporate and some particles can grow to some extent. surrounded by regions where the saturation is near ice saturation. And so you end up with this in different proportions. So in some cases, like the June 6th case, most all of it was near ice saturation. And as you get to other cases, you'll get more and more degrees of pockets of different characteristics there. But these are consistent with the kind of things we see, where you'll see occasional faceted growth that happens on particles, and you'll see some fragments where things have evaporated, and you'll see some areas where the particles have stayed intact for a fairly long period of time. So we did have one case where we found frozen drop aggregates at fairly warmer temperatures, along with the grapple. So here's some at minus 14 to minus 18, and then minus 33 to minus 35 regions. Some of this is pretty solid grapple, and then some of this grapple has protrusions on it. So based on the work that was done in the laboratory, you certainly could have electrical aggregation occurring here, but I also think there's a possibility that this type of material here will actually come off the growing grapple and result in some of these types of particles. So in some sense, there's some suggestion, I think, that some of these frozen drop aggregates may be low density grapple or fragments from the riming process. These type of things have fall speeds around 1 meter per second, nearly independently of the particle size, and easily the kind of particles that could be transported to the top of the anvil as well. So I think there's probably two mechanisms to look further here that are creating the particles that are there. Do we need another term for particles? Everybody would probably like to come up with some sort of a term that would last. It doesn't sound like grapple to me. If you look at the glossary of meteorology, we tend to think of grapple as being a higher density kind of particle. But in fact, in this case, the mechanism is, at least for some of these cases, is due to electrical forces rather than gravitational forces. So there's some reason to be thinking about a separate kind of particle that's present in these clouds. And this mechanism is really not accounted for. So it's something we need to look at further to see how important it is. Some of the other things I think are worth thinking about, we're interested in the optical properties of these clouds. And if you have a field of frozen droplets and they simply collide with each other, you're not going to change the geometric cross-section very much. And particularly since this kind of a particle is going to descend horizontally. So if you're looking at the top of the cloud, things like the albedo aren't going to change very much. So this structure of these particles and the formation mechanism really kind of suggests that the optical properties are going to have a somewhat unique property in comparison to particles that are three-dimensional and are more rounded, like we try to think of particles growing. Okay, well, I'd like to also think more about our frozen drops favored in strong continental convection versus marine clouds. We have some anecdotal evidence from these studies that might suggest that chain aggregates are found commonly in tropical thunderstorms, and that we now have evidence for continental clouds that frozen droplets are present. Past work that I've done and others suggest that, as a general statement, supercooled water appears to be less plentiful in the colder regions of tropical clouds compared to continental. And I think, of course, there's some very good reasons for that. So just to kind of drive the point home, I looked at updraft characteristics of tropical clouds and also compared them to the updraft characteristics that were present in the June 6 cloud. Now, the data I used was from Kwajalein, since I showed some pictures of that, Anderson et al. In 2005 looked at the updrafts in the Kwajalein cases, but there's a more recent paper by Jerry Heimsfield et al. That has very similar results where you can look at the updraft properties. And I took the 10% or the 90%, so they looked at updraft cores, and this was the largest, the magnitude of the 10%. So 90% of the updraft cores had updrafts less than this. So you look at their data, and for the tropical cases, the cloud base is around -20. And the time from, if you were to follow a parcel, assuming it actually rose with the average vertical wind, the time for the thing to reach 0 is over 20 minutes. -10 or so gets to be really long. And so getting to the point where electrical forces would be important takes a very long period of time. And if you compare that to the Doppler measured wind velocity in the June 6th case, it's completely different. Here you're reaching -10 within just a few tens of minutes, and it goes on up to even homogeneous freezing in a fairly short period of time. So as we all know, there's an aerosol effect between continental and maritime clouds. But even ignoring the difference in aerosol concentration, where you might expect that would be an effect, the time that's available for accretional growth and the depletion of liquid water in the tropical cases seems to me to be much more strong than it is in the continental cases. So I think there's a good reason why we might expect to find more frozen droplets in the continental cases, and that these frozen droplets are put in a region where things like electrical forces can play an important role in forming them. So let me summarize with a couple thoughts. I think that these frozen drop aggregates are common particle types in the upper Midwestern anvils. They persist for fairly long periods of time. They're found near single frozen droplets near the top and the sides of the angle. I think there's two mechanisms. The more traditional rhyming process that would produce some low density grapple, but also electrical aggregation, at least for some of the particles, appears to be important. But we're certainly really scratching the surface in terms of what's needed to understand the importance of this, and it's not even included in models of this. We need a better inventory of ice particle types for different storms, particularly with regard to different latitude variations. We've done a lot of work on tropical storms, microphysics, maybe somewhat less so in latitude, and looking at the latitudinal variations, I think is important, particularly with better instrumentation. For example, the lack of particle morphology and the shattering problems have really held progress back for decades, in my view, because we haven't been able to get an accurate depiction of particle morphology with things like frozen droplets. We haven't been able to get a good handle on the number of ice particles that are even present due to the shattering of particles as we're sampling of them. And so I think this has held back progress in this field. The other thing is that these frozen droplets should have very different condensed phase chemistry than depositionally grown ice, and particularly with respect to the nucleation scavenging. So we need a chemical sampling of the condensed phase in order to understand this better, and we need to work this into our models in a systematic way. So it's a work in progress. Really, we're just starting this analysis. We're trying to provide a better context for these frozen drop aggregates. How can you sample them by radar? Can you see them at all in radar? Or can the radar define the precursor conditions for that? And fortunately, in programs like DC3, we have multiple data sources to go to. We have LMA data, and we can try to understand the electrical environment in the storms. We have things like flash rate, and we can use both this combination of radar and LMA data to try to understand it. And then we also have chemical data. So if there's a strong electrical correlation, you might expect measures of past lightning activity could be regions of enhanced NOx. And we can look for correlations there. Another thing I think it's worth looking at is traditionally you'd want to look at the mass dimensional relationships. If it's a linear change, you'd expect the mass to be somewhat proportional to the diameter. If it's more of a round aggregate, you'd expect the mass to be proportional closer to the diameter squared. And then finally, determine the chemical consequences of this, looking for as a source of long-lived upper storm regions that are enhanced in CCN. That's an obvious no-brainer. Some are going to be depositional crystals. Some are going to be frozen droplets. And the comparison with modeling is really just started in terms of looking at these. So as I promised, I've left some time for questions, and I'll go ahead and move to that.
That way it gets through the recording, okay? So, questions?
What's the fraction of internally mixed ice particles in continental clouds?
I'd like to say 7.37, but it's really, from what I can gather, quite dependent on exactly where you're at in the cloud. And so some of these cases were completely homogeneous, like I showed, where it was one particle type. Other ones were more of a fraction where you might have, say, 10% that showed this internally mixture type of things, depending where you're at in the cloud. Others are much more of an external mixture, so you have a depositional crystals separated from the frozen droplets. So we really haven't tried to go through and come up with a fraction by fraction, but that's something that could be done, particularly if we automate the analysis. So far, I've just done this by eye, looking through thousands of ice particles.
Just a couple of thoughts. First, I think it's clear that the large concentrations are due to homogeneous freezing. You know, the little few spin-offs from Grauple are probably, number per liter, whereas you're talking about 50. Once you generate so many drops, then they can't grow very much. So it doesn't matter if they fall in subsaturated air, they'll keep the air pretty moist. So they won't grow much, and they won't evaporate much, so they're sitting there. Now the question is, how do they develop an electrical charge? And one possibility is that, some of the droplets are from cloud base, and some maybe from mid-levels, the drops get activated because the updrafts are pretty strong. And the other thing is high plains clouds might be a little different than Midwestern continental clouds because of Hallamasa types of processes.
Yeah, just a couple comments on that. First of all, I agree with you. I guess there is one thing we found that these frozen droplet aggregates at pretty warm temperatures. So the question is, if they froze homogeneously, how did they get down to much warmer temperatures? It's certainly possible that they would be, and you certainly do see a lot of them at the upper anvil parts of it. But at least some of them seem to be at warmer temperatures. So, but the concentration of frozen droplets per se is probably greatest at the top. So I agree with you. I think the evidence is there for homogeneous freezing is producing a lot of this, but I'm not sure it's the only part of the story there. And I really do agree that this whole thing is controlled by the updrafts, as you know. And we have to somehow relate the particle types to the updraft history and the cloud base history, which is quite different depending on what latitude you're at and the moisture content and the LCL and so forth. And that's where an inventory, I think, would be really helpful. I mean, in some cases, there's probably a lot of homogeneous freezing. Other cases, not so much on there. Certainly the percentage of frozen drops versus depositional aggregates varies quite a bit from storm to storm. And trying to understand and characterize that, I think, is going to be very interesting.
Hey, Jeff, this is very interesting and exciting. I have couple of questions and a comment. One is, and you may have said this, the cases that you've looked at, were they all Colorado, or have you also looked at some in Oklahoma, or I know you were trying to fly in Alabama. So do you have any observations there?
Yeah, I actually put the latitude for this
Yeah,
case.
that doesn't tell me that.
This part here, they are kind of scattered about. I haven't looked in the one case we looked at in detail is a Colorado storm.
Yeah, I understood that. But do you see this in storms in Alabama, for example? One of curiosity for me.
There was one of these that was close to Alabama. I have to go check. We don't have very good anvil data in the Alabama storms. Right.
Thanks. Um, well, one comment is that, no, I've seen these too. I've flown with you in Quadjects and Citation, many anvils in Florida. Um, and there's a bias in the sense that with the Citation, and I think a lot of the other craft, we're tending to fly in deeper in the anvils, more dense parts, as opposed to on the very tips or high up where we don't have the capability. So I'd be very curious actually to go back and look at some of our measurements to see that. But I'm just wondering the frequency that you see this is somewhat a result of where you can fly.
Absolutely. I mean, we're biased by where we can fly,
Yeah,
to be sure.
we all are.
Yeah.
We all are.
Yeah.
But the comment I have, you know, as I said, I've seen these many times, not the droplets, but the chain aggregates of the diffusely grown one. And I have had a hard time convincing myself that this can't happen through the aggregation process itself without electrochemistry, especially when you've got cloud droplets in numerous or very high concentration. Imagine you have droplets in cloud. It's going to tend to fall this way. So the next collision is going to have a propensity to hit the ends. So I'm not convinced that you don't need electric fields to produce this. And I'm wondering, there's some people here that have looked much more at interaction of particles and hydrodynamics and flow. I wonder if you have any comments or others do.
Yeah, I know. Roy, you've looked at this kind of stuff and falling wind tunnel, that sort of thing. Does anybody want to have any other try at that? I mean, it's not a. I look at these particles that are all lined up in a line, and I think, gosh, that sure smacks of some sort of electrical forces to me. But it's still somewhat of an open hypothesis. Al had a question too, but if Roy or anybody has a comment on Jim's.
I just have a quick question. How often do you see these linear chains versus like your heavily branched or larger aggregates? Like what is a percentage of those as the I guess total water volume?
I give some numbers just in terms of counting images, but it's kind of a biased thing to count images. Typically, we have, and then the question is, what is a chain? Which one of those? I mean, you can see the ones that. So I think one of the next steps is to try to make it a little more quantitative in terms of defining an automatic way of identifying chains. Clearly, some of those that I've shown as linear chains are pretty darn linear. Some of the ones that are more branched and then the more larger aggregates, so they tend to be more clumped up. I'd like to understand that a little better to see if there's a way we can pick out the very linear stuff to see if we can relate that to the. But typically, you're talking on somewhere on the order of easily 10% or so will show a linear feature. But it's heavily dependent on where you're in the storm. Some of the storms, you don't find much linear ones, at warmer temperatures especially. But that's kind of just a casual observation from looking at thousands of these images. I'd like to make this a little more quantitative. But kind of the first step was to look at the images. I mean, we don't often have this kind of imagery to look at. And, you know, when I first saw this, I went, oh my goodness, look at that. So it's kind of a starting point is to look at the imagery. But there's a lot more we can do with it, I think. Al Cooper had a question too. I don't want to leave Al out. I'm sure he's got a good question.
Not sure about that. If your hypothesis is right, that electrical fields are required for the chain aggregate, then isn't a simpler explanation of the continental maritime difference, just the observed big difference in electrical activity between continental and maritime? Maybe the maritime clouds just don't have the fields you need.
Sure. I mean, obviously they're dependent on the electric field, so you need both things. You need the droplets and the field. And you're right. But as we know, there's a fair amount of electrical activity even in maritime clouds, but it has to be at the right spot. So it might be that there's simply not enough electric field and droplets present at the same time. So yeah, certainly that could be true.
It has to be fairly intense too.
Yeah, for sure.
Sorry, just a quick question. The droplet size, frozen droplet sizes, is there a threshold size? Do you not see anything below a certain size, or are they all bigger than 20 microns?
I haven't looked at, mostly looking at imagery. They're pretty uniform size-wise. The ones I've looked at are probably from about 15 to 25 microns, judging from the pictures I've seen. But looking at the CDP, you can look at the size spectra as well and try to pick some of that out. Well, they're not. Yeah. Right.
But maybe there's also a sampling problem here, that the trigger for the CPI is a 2D probe, so it has to be big enough that it triggers on the 2D probe before the flash goes off on the CPI camera. So a small droplet won't trigger it in the, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at this, no, he's right. If you look at all these particles, they're stacked up, and you tell me. I mean, those look like there's much variation in the size? Not very, very much. It looks like what we've got are droplets that condense, grew to about the same size. They all froze and clumped together. That would be my reading of it. You don't see a rather big droplet with a smaller droplet next to it, and you can see just from the images I've got here that there's not much evidence for that here. Even some of these are all about the same size droplets. Here's some that are a little larger, but they're also a little out of focus. So, yeah. There's just a lot to learn to take the morphology and put it into context with the other measurements.
But can we really look at these aggregates and say that the standard deviation of the drop size is more or less than what it is with the CDP probe for a normal cloud droplet spectrum?
Well, you could do that by picking stuff that's in focus, doing an analysis using some automated software, and then compare it with something like the CDP size distributions. So, that's the kind of stuff you can do. So there's lots of opportunity to look at this in more detail, I think. But I think I'm really interested in trying to understand, are the electrical forces likely to be present where these things were probably formed based on the LMA data, and also things like the radar. What can we learn about the characteristics where these are formed by combining the LMA data with the Doppler polarimetric data and the modeling data to come up with the story for how this is happening. Yeah, Mary, you're going to tell me about the chemistry here.
No. Actually, I can speak for Brett, who is here, but he was just showing us some plots of the same storm, and during that peak lightning period, he showed that there's this weak echo region where the updrafts are, which gives credence to maybe this is homogeneous freezing, that you just have the small drops, and because the grapple in the hill is shifted downwind slightly. So it is, I think you can learn a lot from the radar data and then put that in context with the LMA.
Oh yeah, because this had a long, strong updrafts and weak echo regions. Anything else? Good.
Okay, no more questions. Again, thank you, Jeff.